Hi, my name is Brenda Romero, and I'm the game director for Empire of Sin.
So Brenda, talk about what you're showing here at Gamescom with Empire of Sin.
Well, we're showing Empire of Sin, as you can see. It is a strategy game set in 1920s Prohibition. This is our first hands-on demo for press today. Been going well, so we're pretty excited about it.
So what does having the game take place in the 1920s open up for you creatively? Because we've seen not necessarily a lot of games take place in that time period, like maybe one or two.
Well, it opens up so much. I mean, it's a really rich time in history. So if you like to have an occasional drink or you, say, owned a bar, it's not a good time when Prohibition hits. If you are, however, an aspiring criminal, it's an amazing time. There's 14 of those aspiring criminals, including obviously Al Capone, but he's not the super Scarface Al Capone that we know of now. He's at the beginning of his career. So we've got that angle. Also, there's building this criminal empire, right? So they've got speakeasies and casinos and breweries and brothels. So they're getting into all different kinds of business. It's an empire of sin, right? So they're getting into what you might expect. But they can't do that alone, so they have to get this crew to work with them. So there's all these enterprising criminals as well, from your Tier 5 guys who are kind of just your average thugs on the street, all the way up to your super elite Tier 1 characters. They work for the boss on a take system, so I kick up a certain amount to the boss. So it ends up really creating a gears on gears on gears dynamic gameplay. Oh, and then there's cops. So the cops get into the action. You start doing too much, the cops get in on the action, but they can be, there were a lot of dirty cops then, so they can be bought, bribed, and then if you go too far, there's the feds, right? So the feds primarily care about those federal crimes, racketeering and breweries, the selling of alcohol and the brewing of alcohol. So it just creates this really rich space.
Talk about the inspirations for creating this universe. Was it a book inspiration? Boardwalk Empire was a big hit a couple of years ago, stuff like that.
Well, certainly Boardwalk Empire is an inspiration. The Sopranos, Peaky Blinders, that all goes in. But the original inspiration goes back to my mom refusing to answer my question. And I grew up in a town in northern New York, and it was on the Canadian border. So there was a bar that was the oldest continuously operating bar in the United States called The Place. And I wanted to know a simple question: how come they didn't shut it down? And my mom didn't want to say, well, it's a gray area, the cops are dirty. Like, there's not a chance she was going to tell me that, right? So she didn't answer the question, and I became fascinated with the time period, and I've had that fascination for 30 plus years. So eventually, a game designer with a fascination, eventually, you will make that game.
Talk about the gameplay in your game. Talk about the combat and explorations like.
Okay, when you first get into the game, you decide which boss you want, first and foremost. That boss has certain diplomatic abilities. They have certain bonuses toward different rackets that they have experience running. So say Daniel McKee Jackson, he had casinos, and that's not limiting you from any specific racket. It's just where you'll have a bonus. So you get into the game, but you haven't got much. In fact, you haven't even got a safe house. And you need one of those because that'll also give you certain defensive and offensive bonuses. So you get in, the first thing you got to do is you got to get a racket. You've got to start to get some kinds of business, get some kind of income. Your income your racket isn't going to be any good if it doesn't have alcohol. So you better start brewing that. So you need a brewery. You can also buy alcohol, but it's going to cost you a little bit more. When you get enough breweries, you can also start to sell it. So your goal is really to start building this empire, start creating money so that your money can make money. However, it would all in fact go great if somebody else also didn't have the same goals as you. So now you need to start securing your places, getting crew to help you take over other places, upgrading your rackets so they're doing better, producing more, having higher draw, and getting people to defend those rackets. So it's about growing the game as other people are trying to do the same, taking them out before they can take you out.
So you have a lot of kind of underworld empire management going on with tier lists and skills and stuff like that, so you can kind of build your underground criminal empire the way you want to build it.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. All that's happening. And while you're trying to do this, remember it is not a time about clean lines and divisions, right? Cops are trying to flip your characters, your loyal crew members might be working for somebody else, so there's all kinds of sabotage going on here. So it's really trying to build an empire within that space.
So aside from the managing your empire, you also have combat in your game that's kind of like a turn-based tactical. Talk a little about that.
Sure. So combat, it is turn-based. It's tactical. Cover matters. It takes place. So It's based on character initiative. Now, I think one of the coolest things that I like about it is every one of the bosses has a special ability that they can use. So, for instance, Al Capone, no surprise, he has a Tommy gun sweep. One of the more unique ones is Frankie Donovan. So there's an Irish sport called hurling, and hurling has something called a hurley. And that hurley is I'm stealing this line from a movie, but it's a cross between hockey and murder. And so Frankie has a hurley, and when he hits people with that hurley, it replenishes his action points. Eventually it runs down, but all the bosses have that. And so combat is, we want it to feel like a tense time. I think another highlight of combat is we have execution moves, but they're not just the standard like, oh, okay, an execution move. So back in the 1920s, well, and now even, if you do an execution, you are sending a message. And you want that message to be heard loud and clear. So an execution move can intimidate the hell out of people who are in combat with you. It can also obviously really piss off whoever you're sending this message to. Characters who commit executions can over time become cruel. And if they become too cruel, they can end up getting a taste for blood. And if left alone with another character, could execute them. Right? So there's cause and effect to everything. Every single action causes something to happen in the game.
So with your crew and your henchmen and sub-bosses, do you have permadeath in the game?
We do, yeah, absolutely. So when you're saying permadeath, if you restart the game, they will be there.
Yeah, I'm saying, like, if you have like a sub-boss that you've grown fond of and he gets killed, is he gone forever?
He could be, yeah. So one thing too that I hadn't mentioned is with this whole crew management, there's another layer to it. Like these characters, there's a dynamic element to them, and then there's also a handcrafted element. So when they come into the game, they've got backgrounds. If you started playing as Maria Rodriguez, she's going to start out the same as my Maria Rodriguez. However, as gameplay progresses, she could develop a hair-trigger temper, she could fall in love, she can make some good friends, she can make some enemies, right? And there's all these different things, all these different relationships that can develop with the characters. They could become alcoholic, they could sober up. If they are paired with a doctor, they might sober up quicker. They might sober up and sober other people up. I mean, obviously during Prohibition, alcohol was a big thing, so.
You kind of have, it's kind of like a dynamic alignment system, like chaotic neutral, evil neutral, good neutral, something like that changes based on the behavior and the stuff you have your characters do.
Well, to a degree. Characters don't necessarily have alignments, but what they go through over time affects them, it affects the squad that they're with, and it can affect you as the boss in the long term. I mean, it's possible that a character could even fall in love with the boss.
Can you talk about how deep your level of management goes to your underground empire? Can you like align yourself with another mafia boss or make in another playthrough make him an enemy?
So yes. So I'll give you an example of how that could happen. So let's just say that early on you recognize that, say, you're not playing Capone. So we'll say you're playing Frankie Donovan. Capone's getting a little bit ahead of you, so you offer an alliance to another boss to work with him against Capone. So you guys both agree to that. In our game, we have the concept of sit-downs, which look like what you think they might look like. Two characters on the screen. They are you're having a conversation with them. It's a first-person perspective. It's a cinematic sequence, but it's not cinematic as in hands off the keyboard. It is, you are actually choosing those actions, and it's part of a dynamic system that if you push somebody too far, it's going to cause them to request a sit-down. So it can happen for a whole variety of reasons. And let's just say you get those two characters or two bosses together. You're aligned against Al Capone. However, it's a tough month for you, and you've decided that you've both worked together, and he's gotten Capone. He's worked with you. You've weakened Capone dramatically, and now you're going to take him out. So you offer to give him some alcohol as a favor, except that alcohol is a bad batch you purposefully brewed. You send that batch to him. He serves it in his businesses, and it causes a bunch of people to die. Clearly, it's the end of your alliance. If he figures out that it was you, it's the end of your alliance, but it's also dramatically sabotaged his empire. And so now you can take him out as well.
So is the goal of the game to basically become the head honcho of Chicago or Atlanta or New York?
The head honcho of Chicago. Okay. So this takes place specifically in Chicago.
What does that open up for you? Because Chicago has such a deep history, not only like in rooted in history, but also in crime.
Yeah, well, so I could have picked, obviously, like you've already mentioned a couple of the other places, and I could have picked New Jersey, I could have picked New York, but what I loved about Chicago is it was where all of these bosses really had their heyday. And then it wasn't just the bosses, it was also the North Side versus the South Side, and the Italians versus the Irish. So there are these factional groups that are going at each other's throats. So it was just this super rich systems I just loved the way that everything interacted there, and to me that was naturally where I wanted to make a game.
So talk about the characters you'll control and have you do tasks and stuff. Will they have skill points you can level up? Do you have an XP system? How does that work?
So, well, the way the characters currently operate in the game is that they have their own things that they're good at. And they come in different tiers, so depending on their skills, how much experience that they've had, they are, like, say, tier 5 character or tier 1 characters are absolutely the best, going on down from there. And then there's even some pretty enigmatic characters in the game who may show up rarely if you happen to be working with somebody that they work with. Each character, all the different RPCs also have their own unique issues. Like, for instance, one person might have forgotten to tell you about this felony warrant that they're on. But if you help them with that, they might make an introduction to somebody later. So there's that element of story also in the game, and bosses even have that as well. So there's one boss, called Elvira Duarte, and she had an issue in Mexico. Now her son knows what that issue is, and there's a possibility that if her son finds out that she's in Chicago, that he will be coming for her. So there's bosses that have those issues. We may have the 5 families visit from New York. You may have the 5 families visit from New York. So there's all these different things that can happen in the game. So these are, I guess, living, breathing characters in a sense.
The 1920s is such an interesting period in our country's history. Why do you think we see more games that take place in that era? Off my top of my head, I can think of LA Noire and Mafia, but even that's later than 1920.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea. Like, this is an area that's been super fascinating to me. And I would even say it's not just games. Like, there's Boardwalk Empire, but are there really a ton of other movies compared to, say, more modern day things? But I loved Goodfellas. I loved The Untouchables. Obviously, was a huge inspiration. Loved Elliot Ness's book by the same name. So there's a lot of different things. I don't know why. I mean, I'm grateful. Like, as a game designer, if there's a game you really want to play, eventually you might get a chance. You might get a chance to make it if nobody else has, and that was the case with this game.